Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome back to Chasing Lullabies. This week, I think for the first time in a while, being broadcast from the shul, as we are out of lockdown a little bit, and in tier 2 at the moment. I'm just wondering, can you hear me okay? Yeah? Great, just let me know if you can't. And I think tonight is going to be an interesting one for me because some of the feedback, and all feedback is really welcome, by the way. I always love to get people's thoughts as how Chasing Lullabies is going. Some of the feedback has been recently that it's almost a little bit overwhelming, that we are creating so many connections and links and overlapping ideas and stories. It's almost like I'm feeling lost amongst this sort of neural network. And that's almost kind of how I've been thinking about it, that this is not necessarily a linear pattern, A to B to C, but rather this is A splinters off into 10 different pieces. Those 10 different pieces get picked up over here and over there and over there. And they all have resonances. It's like a symphony. It's not a linear sort of structure. It's a piece of music. And the piece of music is constantly unfolding and developing. But I realize that it is quite tricky. So what I want to do this evening is to do two things. First of all, is actually maybe a little bit to uncouple from the almost relentless progression of the weekly Torah portion. And we will finish Bereshit at the end of Bereshit, but we might sort of encompass more than one parsha at a time over a couple of weeks. So we might deal with things on a slightly broader level in order to kind of get that bird's eye view that is going to allow us to see and to listen to the whole symphony as it progresses and as it develops. So that's the first thing. But the other thing I want to do is just to take stock of where we're up to. So to almost sort of create a conceptual map of where we're up to so far. And you know, for me, this has been a really amazing journey because most of the Torah content that comes into Chasing Lullabies, so the conceptual material that I'm using, not the way I'm delivering it, but the material itself, that comes from an amazing rabbi in America, Rabbi David Foreman. And I've been listening to his shiurim probably for about 5 years now, since I was introduced to him by a member of ours in Kingston who was a real fan. And so for a number of years now, I've been listening to his material, and over the past few months of this particular term of Chasing Lullabies, so almost every bike ride that I take on my commute between Stevenage and here, or here in Stevenage, so I'm listening to some of his in-depth courses about the parasha. So I've probably got 5 years of sort of listening to his overarching stuff and about 40 hours or so of material that has gone to create, that has come into the Chasing Lullabies here, plus other bits and pieces from other places along the way. So for me also, it feels like we need to just pause and map out what we've done so far. So what I'm intending to do tonight is to look at the map so far, and that's probably going to take us about half an hour. Some of it is going to be review, but I'm hoping that we can keep an open conversation around it as we review what we've done so far. And sort of, but it won't just be a review because it'll be looking at all the links up until now. But we'll also notice on this conceptual map that we draw out that there is a missing piece. And that missing piece will be the second part of this evening's workshop or this evening's presentation, which is to try and work out what is the missing piece of this map. We actually left that question off. We left us with that question last time. We said that if Jacob has finally resolved the issues with Esau, you know, he's battled with the angel, he's spoken to his brother, there's been reconciliation, there's been amendments for past wrongs. So then why is it that Jacob's life is still dogged by disaster, by tragedy, by the premature loss of his beloved wife, by the stealing away of his beloved son, Joseph, by the taking away of his next son from that beloved wife, Benjamin? Why is it that he goes into such a depressed and dark place, that he loses prophecy? Surely, like, the story was finished, the story was done. And yet it doesn't seem to be done at all. And so we're going to find the missing link in our map, which is not just a missing link in the Jacob story. It's actually a missing link in the entire map. And we're going to find some remarkable parallels that are going to bring together, I hope, every single idea that we talked about from the beginning of this term. It's a big ask. And we're going to leave this evening with an appreciation of what that missing link is and a tantalizing suggestion of connection across these different links. And then next week we'll have to pick up some of the depth behind it as well. Does that sound all right? Okay, so I need a visual for this because this is too big to do without a visual. So let me just pull up, here's one I prepared earlier. And I have to do a plug to Russell because he gave us a Canva Pro account. So this has enabled me to create this, Russell. So it was definitely worth the the account. So here's our presentation. I'm just going to present it on the screen. You should be able to see it in big in just a moment. Can you see that okay? Yeah, okay. So tonight's program is entitled Gardens Meets Coats. On my screen, there's like a block of you which is somewhat in the way of the diagram. Can you see the diagram without pictures of other people in the way? Is that okay? Okay, great. What I want to do is I want to start off by the three worlds of creation that we spoke about at the beginning of Genesis. I'll just show you the map right now. We're going to move on from the three worlds of creation to the three goats and coats stories, goats and coats 1, goats and coats 2, goats and coats 3. We're going to then move into the echoes of goats and coats 1, where Jacob seems to marriage to Rachel. There seems to be an exit point where Jacob and Esau make a reconciliation, but then there's a missing link over here, and that's the missing link that we're going to move on to the second part. Okay, fine. So here's my mind map for tonight, and we'll just get, for anyone who hasn't joined us, this is hopefully a helpful summary of what we've done so far. For anyone who has joined us, this is a way to just re-emerge, re-engage with what we're talking about on a very much macro level. So way back in many centuries ago, just as the world began, God created the universe and created the first human. His name was Adam, and Adam had a helpmeet. Her name was Eve. And in that first creation story, there were three different parts. In this garden story, this Garden of Eden story, there were three parts. The first part was a creation event, that there was a creation of the universe, a creation of man, a creation of all the different parts, and a creation also of a tree that held the distinction between good and bad, a tree of Hadat, Eitz Hadas, Bein Tov L'Ra, the tree of knowledge between good and bad. Okay, so that was the second element to this story. And the third element to this story was that there was a Shabbat event, a moment whereby creativity had to be balanced, had to be checked. And we gave the example way back then that the finishing brushstroke or the finishing moment of a painting is not the last brush stroke. It's actually when the painter puts down the brush and decides, I'm not going to paint any further. That means to say that any creative activity, the final act of creativity is to stop creating. Because why? Because we all know, like the parent that is still parenting their children when they're adults. What is that? That's a parent that can't let go. Why can't they let go? They're still creating their children. They're still sort of seeing their children as an extension of them, rather than allowing the children to be distinct, to be separate, to be something that they've created, but then the child has its own independent existence. And that's a fundamental act of creating, is if you carry on painting a painting over and over, you carry on touching it up here, improving it there. At the end, it's just going to be a piece of canvas covered in layer upon layer upon layer of paint. You're never going to finish, right? So I'm seeing Michael right now. I'm going to give Michael a shout out. Michael gave me a very nice haircut today, right? But the final part of the haircut, oh, sorry, Michael. But the final part of the haircut is when you stop cutting. Imagine if Michael carried on cutting and cutting and cutting and cutting, right? You'd get the horrible lockdown haircut that I had a little while ago, where I just basically cut off all my hair. So that's the point, that the point, that the final act of creating is to say, I'm done. So the way to support a creation having an independent existence is to finally say, Shabbat, we will stop. And so there are three elements to the creation story. The first is that there is a creation event. The next is that there was a temptation event, which seemed to actually get the better of the protagonists in Adam's world. And then there was a Shabbat event. Okay. Here, Rabbi Foreman has introduced to us a language to put to what we've been noticing all along. Rabbi Foreman's technical term is the biblical theory, the binary theory of biblical intertextuality, which is fancy mumbo jumbo for the following. The fancy mumbo jumbo is that the Torah seems to have many, many parallels between one story and another story. If there's anything that we've learned from Chasing Lullabies, is that text is not simple at all. These are not simply lullabies that are children's stories, but there are remarkable and astounding parallels between one story and another. The binary nature of that theory is that computers can only communicate in zeros and ones. However, how do you get from a computer only communicating in zeros and ones to the unbelievable richness that we see in front of us? We've got a screen in front of us. There are different colors, there are different shapes, there's language, there's sound, all from zeros and ones. And that's because zeros and ones in combination or in formation can mean very complex things. And so when we have layers of text, one on top of the other, it's not simply that one text is the parallel of another, but actually imagine that there are 15 elements in this story and 15 elements in the next layer. Well, in the next layer, there might be 9 ones, which match the ones up above, and 6 zeros, which are the opposite of the ones in the previous text. That's because there's been a development and a change, but it's a development and change in parallel to the previous story. It's like the Torah is communicating a progression, a thematic, a conceptual progression from one place which is similar to another place which is similar, but with slight nuanced differences to indicate the change that occurs. Therefore, as we follow creation from Adam's world to Noah's world, we saw that there were intertextual parallels where the same imagery, the same language was being used to describe Noah's world as was being used to describe Adam's world. As an example, we gave the image of the universe or the world prior to creation happening. It said in the beginning of Bereshis, Bereshis bara Elokim es hashamayim ve'es haaretz, in the beginning of God creation of the world, of the heavens and the earth, and he says that ha'aretz haysa tohu vavohu, and the earth was there was just chaos everywhere, v'choshech al pnei tahom, and there was darkness everywhere, v'ruach Elokim merachefes al pnei hamayim, and the Spirit of God hovered over the face of the water. So what does it sound like? It sounds like there's darkness, there's chaos, there's wind, and there's water. What does that sound like? Darkness, wind, water. If we move on from creation story 1 to creation story 2, that sounds like a flood. And emerging from that flood is a separation of waters. Just as in creation story 1, in the creation of the universe, God makes a separation between the upper waters and the lower waters. In the Noah story, God closes up the sources of water from above and the sources of water from below. Once again, there's this mirror between the creation story of Adam and the creation story of Noah. It's almost like in the Noah story, there's a new world, there's a new creation. And so that is what happens in Noah too, that we saw that there was a new expression of, there was an intertextual parallel, and we saw multiple comparisons between the text of Genesis and of the creation of the world and the text of the flood, the creation of humanity. Sorry, the recreation of the world post-flood with Noah and those animals. Fine. So that was the creation event. The creation event was this new post-diluvian world, the post-flood world. It's almost like we're starting again, but with some slight differences. There was a Shabbat event in Noah's world as well. We didn't actually talk about it so much, I think, in Chasing Lullabies. But if we look at the language used to describe Shabbat in the creation story number 1 in Adam's world, we'll find many parallels to another moment in Noah's world. Does anyone want to take a guess what the Shabbat event is in Noah's world? I give you a quick clue. If the Shabbat event in Adam's world is not to destroy creation by carrying on creating, instead it's to stop creating so that we don't destroy creation anymore, what's the Shabbat event in Noah's world?
The cessation of the rain.
More than that, that just happened. What's the promise that the rain will never come again?
The rainbow.
That's the rainbow, that's right. Do you know how the rainbow is described? Just as a small example, there are about 25 parallels between the rainbow text and the text of Shabbat in Adam's world. But just as a small example, what's the rainbow described as? The rainbow described as a sign. Okay, so do you know how Shabbat is described? It's also described as a sign, an ot. We say V'shamru nesos Shabbos, that we've got to guard the Shabbat. Ot he, it is a sign. So also the rainbow is a sign. So there are many parallels between the text of the rainbow and the text of Shabbat itself. We're not going to go into the necessary, but the thematic connection is that the rainbow says, I won't destroy anymore. Shabbat says, I won't create anymore. But actually, both of them achieve the same thing. Both of them allow the creation to be independent, to no longer be subject to the whims and wiles or the will of its creator. There's two ways a creator can destroy. It's either by carrying on creating, carrying on cutting the hair, carrying on flicking paint onto the canvas. There's another way the creator can stop creating, or can destroy. It's actually to destroy, to rip the whole thing apart. And so both the rainbow and Shabbat at their heart have the same idea. Now, what was the temptation in Noah's world? So there were two temptations. There were two temptation stories post-flood. Does anyone remember what we described as the two temptation stories? One was to do with technological creativity, and one was to do with biological creativity. It's almost like we split temptation into two different parts. We mentioned it briefly.
There's the wine and the plough.
So that's right. The wine
and the plough.
Great.
What's that?
Yeah, that's right. So we talked about the wine. We talked about Zayin Achamenu, that Noah is going to come for us, and that was the plow. We're going to talk about the technological creativity, which really the technological side of its creativity found its culmination after the temptation for technological creativity found its culmination after Noah's story, after the flood in the Tower of Babel. That man wants to make a name for themselves. They want to make a legacy for themselves. They want to individuate, to become so independent that they're going to be a match to God. So that was the technological creativity. And that the seeds of that, Jonathan's right, you're right. We began with Noah himself, where his father proclaims, Zayin Achamenu, this man's going to give us comfort. And the Medrash says, why is he going to give us comfort? Because he's going to give us a plow. He's going to give us a plow where we can become inured to the curses of Adam, of Granddaddy Adam. Granddaddy Adam was cursed with a particular curse. Granddaddy Adam was cursed with the curse that he would have to toil and work the ground. His grandmummy Eve was cursed with the curse that she would have pain during childbirth. But Granddaddy Adam, he meant the world would have to become, we'd have to work hard. The ground would become hard and brittle. Just as at the moment, it's just like wet and mushy, but probably as the frost sets in, it'll become hard and it'll become brittle and it'll become difficult to work. And so we are going to become we're going to live alongside that curse. We're not going to try and repair the damage that we did. We're going to make a plow. We're just going to become inured to that curse. And that technological creativity found its zenith. It found its zenith in the story of the tower. There, they are so infatuated with their own creativity. They say, look, we can make bricks. No longer are we using stones. We can make our own raw materials. We are so technologically advanced. Let's use these bricks to make a name for ourselves, our own legacy, not God's legacy, our legacy. And so that was the temptation of technological creativity. The temptation of biological creativity came after God commanded Noah to multiply and to repopulate the earth, and Noah instead makes some wine and gets drunk. And there is a scene there where his son, the Medrash says, either castrates him or rapes him, but seemingly there's a backfiring of the call from God for biological creativity by Noah willingly engaging in this tree, this fruit, once again, a fruit-like imagery, which allows his own biological creativity to become perverse and to become twisted, either to be taken away or to be done, or to not be used for procreation. And so we have those three elements of a garden story. We have a post-creation account, the textual comparisons between the ending of the flood and the creation of the world. We have a tree temptation and technological creativity and biological creativity, which is a similar temptation to the first tree of knowledge. Because what did we say was the temptation of the first tree of knowledge? What did we say is the temptation for any mini creator? Is to become so independent that we ourselves we're going to become detached from our ultimate creator, and we're going to become so so infatuated with our own creativity, we're going to forget that it's all coming from God, it's all stemming from God. We're going to become so infatuated with our own creativity, we don't want to see the world in terms of true and false. That's what they saw before. That's what they saw before they'd eaten from this tree of knowledge. Remember, way back in the first shiur, in the first lecture, I don't know if we call it a lecture, shiur, workshop, presentation, whatever. So the first one we had, the first Chasing Lullabies on Genesis, Jeff asked the question. The question was, how can Adam and Eve be punished for eating from the tree of knowledge between good and evil? If this tree conferred knowledge between good and evil, that must mean they did not know the difference between good and evil. So therefore, how can they be guilty of this wicked deed? They didn't know the concept of wickedness. And we said they knew the concept of true versus false. They knew the concept of objective morality. They were so infatuated with their own creativity, they wanted to be plunged into a world of subjective morality, whereby they themselves would have to call the shots. They could say, this is good to me. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. Maybe just a small example. This is the example that Rabbi Foreman gives in his book, The Beast That Crouches at the Door. He says, one dark night, you've gone out for a drive in lockdown 2.0. No, in lockdown, we don't go for drives then, in tier 2. And you've gone to pick up your takeaway from Sammy's in Edgware or wherever it is. Gone to pick up your takeaway from Sammy's, and it's foggy like it's been recently, and the visibility is absolutely awful. And so as you reverse out of the parking space on a side street in Edgware, you hear a horrendous crunch. And you jump out of your car, nervous as the shawarma is steaming in the seat beside you, sort of spilling hummus and tahina onto the upholstery. And you notice that actually you haven't seen the Porsche 911 that was parked behind your car, and you've reversed right into the front of this Porsche. And it's just smashed up. It's absolutely in a horrible situation. It's a horrible state. What do you do? Well, in the world of right and wrong, in the world of true and false, the thing you do is you leave a note on the windscreen of the Porsche saying, sorry, Mr. Porsche owner, I made a really bad mistake. I couldn't see your car. Here are my contact details. Contact me so we can arrange the insurance claim. But in the world of good and bad, other things could start to play on one's mind. You could think about it like this. This guy, he owns a Porsche. I mean, if he can afford a Porsche, he can afford to repair the Porsche. I mean, it's not really fair what's going on in lockdown at the moment. I'm on a basic salary. I've been on furlough. I can barely manage the month's insurance payments. This guy, he's probably been in the PPE business. Like, he is making money on the back of everyone here. That's why he's driving a Porsche. He doesn't need my insurance claim. I would be doing a service to society to redistribute wealth by allowing him to pay for the insurance claim. So all those poor garages that haven't had money coming in during lockdown, they will have a bit of Mr. Porsche's money. And actually, if you think about it some more, my car, it's probably not worth the value of the front of his Porsche. So if this goes to the insurance claim, I'm not going to be able to afford to drive anymore. Now, if I can't drive, well, I can't do my job as a rabbi anymore. If I can't do my job as a rabbi, well, think of all the funerals in Bushy that I won't be able to get to. Like, I'm actually doing a mitzvah. I'm actually doing a mitzvah by not leaving a note, because then I can at least go and do all the mitzvahs that I do as a rabbi. So I'm just going to drive off into the distance, and that's the good thing to do. It would be bad to leave a note. It would be good to drive away and redistribute wealth. This man can afford it anyway. And I need to carry on doing mitzvahs, don't I? So if I was to say that to myself, I can convince myself of anything. When it's in the world of good and bad, what's good can mean two things. Good can mean it's nice, but also good means it's subjectively good. I like it. It's good to me. It's confusing. It's quite subjective. Now, where's the litmus test? The litmus test is if you tell anyone else this story, they say, you idiot, you jerk. You should have left a note. You backed into his car. What were you doing? But whereas everyone else hears the hypocrisy, everyone else hears the mistaken logic, we ourselves can convince ourselves of that. We can convince ourselves of many different things. We can become so infatuated with our own creativity, with our own ability to make new things, to make new ideas, that maybe we individuate so far away from God that we cease to come back. Remember, there was a movement that we talked about in the beginning sessions. There was a move to individuate, to become the best creator I can be, but then to come back and recognize that that creativity is sighted underneath God's greatness. It's almost like there was a setup. It's almost like there was a setup in Adam's world, that if we're going to give creativity to these people, they're going to want to allow their creativity to run away with them. They're going to want to create and create and create to make it their own. And the cost will be to eat from the tree. The advantage will be that when we do come back and link our creativity back to God in our own Shabbat, where we say, just as God rested as the ultimate creator, we rest as mini creators. Just as God told us, gave us, and what did God make us in his image? God has made us in his image. And what was God doing until this point in time? He was creating. So too we are, in the greatest sense of our godliness, creative beings. So too we'll bring that creativity and we'll nest it under God's dominion. But now there's going to be a challenge. Now, in order to nest it under God's dominion, I'm going to have to overcome my subjective bias and place it back in objective morality in God's world. In Noah's world also, there was this sort of pull away, this tug. In my technological creativity, I'm going to make a name for myself, not a name for God. In my biological creativity, I'm going to make a name. I'm going to try and make a name for myself in this sort of vineyard-like event. And it's going to get perverted with a mistake with my son. And so we have the third creation event, the third world. This is Abraham's world. We asked, what makes Abraham so special? What makes him the one who's going to become the next protagonist, the person who's going to continue the mission of God? The only thing we know about Abraham is that when his brother dies, he's willing to sacrifice his own biological creativity by marrying his brother's daughter, Yiska, Princess Sarai. He's been willing to marry her in a proto-Yibum-like act, whereby if I marry someone else who hasn't been able to have their full legacy expressed, then the children that we have through our shared biological creativity will not only be our children, they'll be my family's children as well. They'll be my brother's children. My brother, he needed some good children. And so I'm going to marry his daughter to continue his legacy. I'm going to marry my biological creativity to someone else. It won't be my legacy, it'll be his legacy. That was in the world of biological creativity. In the world of technological creativity, Abraham does two things. He builds X and he pitches Y. He builds altars and he pitches tents. He builds altars for God, permanent structures that demonstrate that he wants to use his technological creativity not to build his own legacy, but to build God's legacy. And he'll pitch tents for himself, whereby he'll have a temporary dwelling for him and not to use his technological creativity for his own aggrandizement, like the tower builders, but instead he will live in temporary structures which will be pitched and then taken down, and so on and so forth. However, Abraham still struggles with what? What's the temptation? So the creation event for Abraham seems to be his ability to create for others. to give his creativity to some other cause, whether that's the cause of brother or the cause of God. He's giving his creativity to someone else. That's what makes him Abraham. That's what gives him the rights to become the first Hebrew. But what's his temptation? It's still temptation of legacy, but it's temptation in a different way. God promises Abraham two things. He promises him he's going to have land and he's going to have children. You're going to have Israel and you're going to have lots of kids. And the only problem is, the first thing we find out about Sarah, or about Yiska, about this lady, after he marries her, is that she can't have kids. And so the temptation is, what do you do now? You've been promised legacy, and your wife cannot have children. You cannot conceive with her. Maybe it'll be Lot. Maybe it'll be his nephew. We find that Lot doesn't quite do it. He goes into a deep sleep and he asks God for advice. He says, who's it going to be? Is it going to be my servant Eliezer? Him? That's what you mean? And God doesn't seem to answer him. It's almost like there's information that is too dangerous to be given at the moment. Abraham presses him further and says, please, what is it? What's going on? So in the end, God relents. And God says, you're going to have a child, a biological child. You are going to have a biological child. He wakes up. He wakes up from a deep sleep, just as Adam woke up from a deep sleep. Who did Adam, the first man, see when he woke up from a deep sleep? Anyone know? Eve, right, Jonathan. He said he met Eve. Who did Abraham meet when he woke up from his deep sleep? The next thing it says is that he saw Sarah. It's almost like God was saying, it's her. It's her. You wanted to know how you're going to have a biological child? I'll tell you how. Through your wife, my friend. It's going to happen. Now, remember, we read with the end in mind. We know that there's going to be a miracle. We know that Sarah is going to conceive later on in life. But Abraham doesn't know that. The furthest thing that Abraham is expecting is some miraculous conception. Excuse the pun. It's some miraculous conception when Sarah is postmenopausal after having had years of infertility. Now, all of a sudden, Sarah's going to conceive. It's the last thing he expects. And because he's been told he's going to have a biological child, and he crucially shares that information with his wife, so his wife says, I'm going to have to build myself up through somebody else. Building. What does that remind us of? Building. It reminds us of the language that is used to describe the creation of Eve. But who's Eve now? Eve is no longer Sarah. There's a new Sarah on the block. Sorry, there's a new Eve on the block. Who's the new Eve on the block? It's Hagar. Hagar now takes on the mantle of Eve, as she has Abraham's first biological child, Ishmael. The problem is the plan doesn't quite work out, because Sarah had intended for Ishmael to become her son. However, Hagar, the princess from Egypt, also a princess, decides to actually, no, it's her son. And Sarah becomes diminished in Hagar's eyes. And then we have the expulsion of the expulsion of Hagar at the instruction of Sarah. By the way, what's the Shabbat-like event in Abraham's world? So just as in Noah's world there was a covenant, the Shabbat-like event in Abraham's world is the covenant where he's put to sleep. It's the covenant between the parts. He's promised that there's going to be land and there's going to be children. There's a promise that his creativity, his legacy will continue come what may. There is a Shabbat-like event, a relationship event, a Brit-like event, and the language of covenant mirrors the language of the rainbow of covenant. And again, there are textual similarities that we can't go into right now. But then he wakes up from that covenant event, from that Shabbat event, and he mistakes the signs. Okay. Those were the garden stories. 3 stories of creation. A creation in Adam's world. Adam is given the whole world, and he has to individuate in terms of his own creative legacy and then try and return back to God, but the return is foiled. In Noah's world, there's a creation-like event. The world is recreated. And again, man gets infatuated with his own creativity, his technological creativity, his biological creativity, and the return doesn't happen. And then there's finally Abraham's world, a man who struggles with his creativity, a man who was chosen because he was able to put his creativity on the side, to take the self out of this and return it back to God. I will give a child to someone else. I will give a home to God. But Abraham does struggle with this throughout his life. However, finally, in Abraham's last major journey that we witness, he's able to sort of hold all the creative tensions in mind and in heart, as we saw as he climbed the mountain to take his son up, to offer him up to God, that mountain of the Akedah, of the binding of Isaac, started with Abraham saying to God, Hineni, here I am. It ended with Abraham saying to God, Hineni, here I am, meaning, God, I'm here for you. I have a relationship with you. My legacy is entirely given over to you. And at the same time, at the very top of that mountain, Abraham was able to say to his son, and we saw this not just as a physical mountain, but a textual mountain using the chiastic structure of A, Z, B, Y, etc., or Aleph, Taf, Bet, Shin, an Atbash structure. We saw in this chiastic structure that the center of this whole story was that Abraham is able to respond to his son, Hineni, Bani, here I am, my son. My creativity can maintain a legacy whereby I'm entirely loyal to you, my child, but also entirely loyal to you, my God. That was the first map that we have drawn out in Chasing Lullabies, which is the left hand of the dotted line. Any comments or reflections so far in this whistle-stop review of Chasing Lullabies? Is everyone with me? Yeah? Okay. So we then moved on to a different era, a different epoch, which was marked by goats and coats. We had goats and coats in the Jacob and Esau story, where Jacob seemed to deceive his brother. We did talk about a plan A and a plan B. That plan A, from Rebecca's perspective, was to activate Jacob's latent potential, to help him to become a doer. A doer. You're going to be a doer just like your brother Esau is a doer. And yet, Jacob falls into deception. There's a coat which Jacob covers himself in. There's a coat that he wears to pretend to be Esau, and there's a goat that he prepares for food for his father. And there are many textual parallels between the Jacob and Esau story up here on the top right, and two goats and coats stories at the bottom over here. They're at the bottom over here because they actually happen a lot later. And if you remember, we saw this in a diagram that I produced, another slide that I produced, where we had the Joseph and his brothers stories on the left-hand side and the Judah and Tamar story on the right-hand side. And we had Once Upon a Time and a story involving goats and coats. There were two. There was a brother who had died owing to a lack. Sorry, there's someone who had died owing to a lack of loyalty between two brothers. I can try and pull up the slide if you want. But essentially what we saw was that the story of Judah and Tamar mirrored almost exactly the story of the sale of Joseph and his brothers. You know what? Let me just pull up the slide if I can find it very quickly, because it will help us to recall what happened over there. And I'm not going to be able to find it, am I? Oh, it's probably just in my documents. 1 second. All my confidential patient information is on it. 1 second. And my computer's freezing. Here we go. Goats and coats, there we go. It's nice when things sort of work. Okay, so we had this slide, if you remember. Okay. Do you know, it's easier without. So where we saw two tracks. Once Upon a Time and a story involving goats In coats and goats, Judah gave his coat as a collateral payment to Tamar for her services rendered. This coat was later given to Judah to identify, using the Hebrew language Hakirna, please recognize, and goats. A goat was Tamar's fee, for which Judah offered his coat as collateral. There lived people who were enduring an unending mourning for a person who was not quite dead. Tamar mourned for a husband, heir, not fully dead, as his legacy had the potential to live on through Yibum, by Tamar having a child with a surviving family member, and a man who lost 2 children. Judah lost Er and Onan when they died following the relationship with Tamar. Owing to a failure in loyalty of one son to another, Onan should have completed Yibum to continue his brother's name, something he was unwilling to do. He was desperately trying to hold on to his 3rd son, Yehuda. Judah would not let Shelah marry Tamar, lest he lose another son, even though this would end the cycle. If Shelah would marry Tamar, Er's legacy would live on. So we said this story is an exact parallel to the Joseph and Jacob story, to the famous Technicolor dream coat. Once upon a time, in a story involving coats, that Jacob gave Joseph the famous coat, and when Joseph's brothers sold him, they took the coat, dipped it in blood, and gave it to their father Jacob to identify, using the Hebrew Hakirna. The only other time we find this language, Hakirna, also when Tamar is holding out the coat to her father-in-law and asking him if he recognizes who the coat is from. And there's a goat. The brothers killed a goat to dip the coat in its blood to demonstrate to their father that Joseph had been killed. There lived people who are enduring an unending mourning for a person who was not quite dead. Jacob mourned for Joseph, for whom there was no body or burial, leaving a crippling suspicion always lurking in his heart. We mentioned Ron Arad and his widow, who was always wondering, where is Ron? And a man who lost 2 children. Jacob lost Joseph when he was sold, and then lost Shimon when he was imprisoned in Egypt, owing to a failure in loyalty of one son to another. Shimon, as the 2nd oldest brother, should have supported the oldest brother Reuben, who had tried to protect Joseph from the anger of the other brothers. Who was desperately trying to hold on to his 3rd son. Jacob would not let Benjamin go down to Egypt, lest he lose another son, even though that would end the cycle. If Benjamin were to go down to Egypt, Joseph would reveal himself, and Shimon would be released. So I can't see. There we are. So back to our diagram, or map over here. That we said that the goats and coats story of Jacob and Esau finds its fruition and fulfillment, or finds its mirror or its resonance, its symphony, so to speak, but quite a sad symphony, in the goats and coats story of Joseph and his brothers, and the goats and coats story of Judah and Tamar. It's almost like the goats and coats where Jacob inflicts pain upon Esau, comes round to haunt him, to destroy him almost. How does it destroy him? Because he loses his beloved son, the firstborn of Rachel, his beloved wife, in this goats and coats stories too. Who was the architect? Who was the mastermind, seemingly, of the sale of Joseph? It was Judah. And so what goes around comes around. Judah is then also haunted by the goats and coats story as he falls out of favor. And it's only when Judah turns around and owns up to his own part in the process that goats and coats is almost redeemed. But we see 3 stories. Just as there were 3 stories of creation, there seems to be 3 stories of goats and coats. Okay. But in the middle, there was something else. And by the way, the goats and coats story doesn't just have echoes through to the brothers. It also even has echoes through to the Purim story that we saw last week, that when Esau cries out, Vayizak za'aka gadolot, he cries out a great and bitter cry, umarot, when he learns that the blessings have been taken. It's the same cry that Mordechai cries, Vayizak za'aka gadolot umarot, that when he learns of the genocide of the Jewish people. A descendant of Esau, known as Haman, will finish the job. Now, before we actually got chronologically to the brothers' story, to the Judah story, there was another connection that we made. Jacob's marriage to Rachel has been haunted by goats and coats. We learned the verses last week that when Esau learned of the loss of the blessings, learned of the deception, Vatisa Vayisai kolo vayevk. He raised up his voice and he cried. When else is there a case of someone raising up their voice and crying? It's when Jacob meets Rachel for the very first time. There's this dramatic scene there by the well. There's the massive rock that it takes normally all of the gathered shepherds' might to get the rock off the well. And yet Jacob is able to lift it up when he sees this apparition in front of him, Rachel. And he kisses her, and then he cries. And Werner said, like, the clear meaning of, or the simple meaning of that verse would say that he's crying out of happiness. He's found his beloved. He's found his soulmate. But there was a more sinister midrash that told us either he's crying because he realizes in prophecy that he won't be buried with her, or he's crying because he has no money. He has no money to offer as a dowry payment because his money was stolen by Esau's son who came to kill him. Eliphaz, Esau's son, came to kill him. Eliphaz couldn't quite finish the job. He'd been brought up in the house of Isaac after all. He's a good egg, or the apple doesn't fall that far from the tree. He can't kill his uncle. So his uncle, but he says, what can I do? Because my father's told me I have to kill you. So Jacob has a cunning plan. He says, look, take my money, take all my money. A person who's poor, it's as if they're dead. So he takes all the money, and now Jacob meets Rachel and he has no money. Now, how would this story have played out differently if Jacob had had that money? So he'd go to his future father-in-law Laban, and he would have money to offer him. He wouldn't have to wait 7 years. He wouldn't have the trick of the younger daughter being swapped for the older daughter. Says Laban, Lo yasa came bim kumenu. We don't do this in our place. La tes hat seirot lifnei habechira, to put the younger one before the older one. We don't do it like you did, Jacob. You, the younger one, put yourself before the older one. You put yourself before your brother. We don't do that in our place. Now, the only reason that Jacob's being taken advantage of is because he has no money. And actually, it's the one second. It's that tension. It's that tension about who is going to be the beloved, who is going to come out of a dark place and receive blessing, that seems to lead to the loss of Rachel. That the blessings seem to be... No, I'm not going to say that part. Fine. Anyway, so had Jacob had some more money, had Jacob had some means, he wouldn't have lost Rachel. He wouldn't have had to cry. Because what goes around comes around. He caused his brother to cry. Now he himself in turn will cry. However, there was a reconciliation. Jacob and Esau reconcile. They meet. Jacob changes. He's no longer Jacob. He's no longer bent. Jacob means an ankle. It's not straight. It's bent. Esau is fully made. Jacob's bent. His mother wanted him to be straight. His mother wanted him to be straightforward with his father, to say, look, I'm a doer too. I can also do something. The truth is, he does become a doer. He becomes someone who takes blessings, but he does it in a roundabout way. He does it in a Jacob way. Now he needs to become straight, face things head on. And so he meets the angel of his brother, but is it really? Because remember, these twins are identical twins. He meets a man, but there wasn't anyone else there. It's almost like he's battling himself that night when he battles the angel. And the angel says, you know, you want a blessing. You don't really want a blessing. You need a name change. You need to learn that you can be someone else. You can be Yisrael. You can be Israel. Why? Because you fought. You struggled with others and with God, and you prevailed. You were able to fight face on, to give a real, you were able to look someone else in the eye and to not be backwards, to not be underhand, to not be crooked. Instead, to be, you've learned something. You've learned the value of truth. You've learned the value of doing things in the right way. And that's how Jacob goes to meet his brother Esau. He goes to meet him and face him head on. He seeks out a meeting. This is not someone who's going around trying to avoid issues, trying to avoid the problem. No, he goes to meet him. He bows down to him. He says, take your blessings. Take them. You are my master. You deserve them. And then, crucially, they both cry. They hug and they cry. This time, it's not Esau crying by himself or Jacob crying by himself. Jacob and Esau seem to reconcile. And so we could ask, if there's a reconciliation over here, we've gone from goats and coats 1 to the problems of Jacob's marriage to Rachel, but there's a reconciliation. We've solved the ghosts of the past. Why is it that we have goats and coats 2 and goats and coats 3? What got in the way? Really, actually, this diagram should be the other way around. Really, there's an event that actually happened before. No, there's an event that happened before the reconciliation, but after Jacob's marriage to Rachel, maybe it's not so bad. Maybe there's an event that happened before this event, but after this event that kept the tragedy going. And this is the missing link. What's the missing link? Can anyone guess what event happened after Jacob's marriage to Rachel, before Jacob and Esau reconcile, that kept goats and coats alive? By the way, are we okay? And so 2 things. First of all, any thoughts or comments so far? Because now we've finished our entire review and conceptual map of what we've done until now. But also, any thoughts? So first, any questions on that? Also, any thoughts about what the event could be? It's an often overlooked event in the stories, but it's crucial.
Is it something to do with Rachel stealing the statues from her father's house?
All the prizes to Francis. All the prizes. Fantastic. Nice round of applause there, Michael. It's right. There is a very overlooked but crucial event. Rachel steals the teraphim. She steals these teraphim. Now, I'm not going to necessarily, we often translate them as idols. Other people translate them as diviners, as things that would tell the future. She steals them from her father, Laban. And if you don't mind, if I take a tiny bit more time, then I want to show you some scary parallels between the teraphim event and those that comes before and that which comes after. So just to, if you see the conceptual map, so then the question mark event is the teraphim event, is that event where Rachel steals these things from her father Laban. Okay, so let me just take you through a whirlwind tour of the links that the teraphim have. One second. I want to set up for you that the teraphim event, this teraphim event, is not just the loss going to be the loss of Rachel. It's going to be the loss of everything that Rachel has given to Jacob. That this teraphim event is going to cause not only Rachel to die, it's going to cause Joseph to be lost, and it's even going to cause Benjamin to be lost. He's going to lose everything. As Jacob was leaving the house of Laban, Rachel surreptitiously takes these teraphim. What are them? So what are these things? So we said that they're not necessarily, they might be idols, they might be divination instruments, and Laban runs after Jacob because someone has taken these teraphim and he's intent on getting them back. By the way, what's that image? There's a father who's looking for something that has been taken away. No, 1 second, sorry, carry on. And so, I'm losing my track. So Jacob doesn't know that Rachel has taken these teraphim. Let me set it up in the broadest sense. And so Jacob makes a very, very bold promise. He says, I'm not a thief. I didn't steal anything. Laban has said to him, you're a thief. So he says, I'm not a thief. I didn't steal anything. But if you find the thief, says Jacob, the one with whom you find your gods, your teraphim, lo yichya, they will not live, they will die. And with that, Jacob himself declares death upon Rachel. Lo yichya, that's what our sages come to see, that Rashi brings a statement from our sages that the reason Rachel dies young is because of these words. Rachel's going to die young because her husband has himself cursed her. And not only will she not live, but Jacob will lose her son, Joseph. He'll lose her son, Benjamin. This is where goats and coats will find its unfinished business, will carry on haunting and dogging the life of Jacob. And if you think about it, it happens just before Jacob has been able to end the story himself. It happens just before Jacob has made his amends with his brother. So just before Jacob makes his amends with his brother, then along comes his wife and keeps the story alive. She steals the Trafim. But we need to that's just a theory. Let's see if the verses themselves about the Trafim teach us anything about goats and coats. So let's think. Laban catches up to Jacob, and let's just take a look at that story of Jacob searching for these Trafim. So the words themselves, Laban walks into the tent and he's looking for these Trafim, and it says, Vayamashesh Lovon es koil ha'ohel velo motzo, that Laban is searching around the whole tent and he doesn't find it. He's feeling around trying to find his Trafim, but he can't quite find it. So here's a father trying to find stuff that his daughter has hidden, and he can't see, and he's feeling around. What does that sort of remind you of? Anyone? Father can't see something his daughter has hidden or child has hidden, and he's feeling around for it. What does that remind you of?
Isaac feeding Jacob.
That's right. Isaac feeding Jacob, the first deception story. It's exactly the same language. Also, Geshana va'amushecha, come close to me and I will feel you, Isaac says to Jacob. I'm going to touch you. It's the same language of identification of father trying to find something the son is hiding, both in the case of Isaac meeting Jacob and in the case of Laban searching the tent. Now let's think about Laban's motivation. What is Laban's motivation? Why is he wants to come? He says, Lama, why have you run away? You didn't even give me a chance to kiss my children goodbye. Let's talk about kissing children. When we last heard of a father kissing a child? It's in the story of goats and coats. Number one, what did Jacob's father tell him? He says, come close and let me kiss you. Come close and kiss me, my son. Here we have another father who wants to kiss her. Laban runs after his children because, Rachel's his daughter, Leah's his daughter. He wants to kiss his children goodbye and his grandchildren goodbye. And here's the final kick. If you look at the very end of the story of the Trafim, at the very end of the story, Laban leaves. And let's see. And Laban says, Vayashkem Lavan Baboka. Laban gets up in the morning. Laban leaves, and look what he does. Vayinashek Lavan Nav Livnosov. He gives a kiss to his children. Vayivarechosom Eshen. And he blesses them. A father running after his children, not just wanting to kiss them, but wanting to bless them. It's the same story of goats and coats. The only thing is, it's not Jacob who is doing the deception in this story. It's his wife, Rachel, who's performing that deception. And somehow that's the issue. Rachel doesn't tell her husband that she has been deceiving her father. Maybe things would have been different if she had. That's the tragedy. The tragedy is we're on the way to redeem goats and coats. We're on the way to meeting Esau, to finally finding the end of this. But Rachel takes matters into her own hands. She wants the divining instruments of her father. She wants them, actually, I think, to help out her husband to perform his mission. But she's too hasty. She's kind of taking her legacy, the promise of legacy, and taking that promise into her own hands. That hastiness that we've seen before, that has been the hallmark of the failures of Abraham, the hallmark of the failures of Rebecca, and now possibly the hallmark of the failure of Rachel, is that slight hastiness, taking matters into her own hands. There are more comparisons too, and I'll just maybe for 5 more minutes and then we'll end and take some comments. So what's Rachel doing? Why is she stealing? So she's trying to help her husband. She's doing her own version of the goats and coats story. But the real tragedy is that these ramifications will cause her to die, will cause her child to be lost, will cause Benjamin to be challenged. And we're going to see those comparisons as well. You see, Laban and Jacob make amends. They make amends in a place called Gal-Aid. The place is called Gal-Aid. It's called Gal-Aid because Gal means pile of stones and Aid means testimony. Keep Gal-Aid in mind because later on there is a reference to a place called Gal-Aid. Just 1 second. Let me tell you. Jacob's words over here. He says, anyone who imasher timsayes elokecha lo yechia neged achenu haker lecha ma'imadi. He says, with whomever you find your gods, they will not live. They will not live. This person will not live. That's the curse he gives against his wife unknowingly. But he says, haker lecha, recognize, please, recognize your stuff. Haker, recognize. Where else have we seen the words haker lecha? These have been found in all the goats and coats stories. It says about Isaac, lo yakirenu, he did not recognize his son Jacob. It says in the story of the sale of Joseph, hakerna, please, in the sale of Joseph, please, the brothers say to their father, please recognize this bloody coat. Please recognize it. It says in the story of Judah, when Tamar is holding out the coat, hakerna, please recognize it. It's the same language in Goats and Coats 1, Goats and Coats 2, Goats and Coats 3, and in the story of Laban and the Teraphim. Not only that, but in the story of the sale of Joseph, Joseph is sold to a group of travelers. And the Torah seems to tell us a really interesting detail that is almost irrelevant. It says these travelers, you know where they're coming? These Ishmaelites, they're coming from Gilad. What does that sound like? Gal-Aid, the same place that Laban and Jacob make their covenant, is the place that is going to be the source of the selling of Joseph. It's almost like the long arm of Laban. The long arm of the Teraphim story is coming to haunt him. Think about it. When Laban and the brothers, Laban sits down with Jacob to make this covenant, it says the brothers, the Yeshvu le'echol lechem, they sat down to eat bread. There's only one other story in the entirety of the Chumash where there's brothers sitting down, or the people sitting down to eat bread. It's when the brothers sit down after the sale of Joseph to sit down to break bread. And then the travelers from Gilad come, that place Gal-Aid, the same language. And these Teraphim themselves, the language of Teraphim, there's almost like a word play here. Teraphim means two tarafs. Two tarafs. It's like the plural of taraf is Teraphim, two tarafs. Where have we ever heard two tarafs before? Well, when the brothers take this bloody coat to their father, they say tarof. The father says tarof, toraf, he was surely ripped to pieces. Teraphim, two tarafs. It's like the Teraphim are coming to rip Joseph away from their father. Not only is a death sentence on Rachel, which is why she dies in childbirth, but there's a death sentence on Jacob as well. And we're going to go a little bit further as well. But Rachel is described, Rachel lakach et Teraphim. She takes the Teraphim. What does she do with the Teraphim? Vatsesimem bechar hagamal. She puts them in the saddle pack of her camel. She puts them in the saddle pack. Bachar. It's a very, very unique language, the saddle pack, Bachar, base, chaf, reish. What else does base, chaf, reish spell? It spells Bachor, her firstborn. She takes her firstborn and she puts it on the camel. It's almost like Rachel is taking her firstborn and putting him on the camels of the Ishmaelites, who's going to take him down to be sold to slavery in Egypt. Vateshev aleichem, and she sits on these. And she says to her father-in-law, she says, I can't get up. I'm sorry, you want me to get up and search. I can't get up. I can't get up. Why? Because derech nashim alai. It's the way of women at the moment. I've got my period, she says. Essentially she's saying, I'm sitting on bloody rags. She's sitting on her son Joseph, who's going to become nothing more than a bloody coat, a bloody rag. And I'll just tell you one more haunting moment. When Jacob protests against his father-in-law Laban, he says, Ze esrim shana anochi imach. For 20 years I've been with you. For 20 years I've been working for you. Rechelecha v'izecha lo shikelu. Your goats and your lambs, lo shikelu, they never miscarried. Rechelecha, your rochels never miscarried. Now, you know what? If Rachel had miscarried, maybe it wouldn't have been such a bad thing. Because if Rachel had miscarried, she wouldn't have died in childbirth with Benjamin. Because what's the opposite of miscarrying? It's hemorrhaging to death in childbirth. If I bring us back to our original map, the map that we've been trying to work through today, we find a very scary reality. We find that this missing piece is the Teraphim story. A Teraphim story that has echoes of the first goats and coats story, but also is the direct introduction, the direct precursor to the next goats and coats story, and also to another story of the loss of Rachel. Rachel is being doomed in this story, and so it doesn't end. We asked, why doesn't it end? The answer is because Rachel got in there too early. She became the deceiver, deceiving a different father now, her own father, taking the Teraphim, taking action into her own hands. And so the death sentence, the long arm of Laban, will continue to take away her, to take away her son Joseph to a bloody pile of sheets, to take away her son Benjamin, and her in the loss of that, in the ending of that pregnancy. And she will die, and Benjamin will be taken down to Egypt as well. I'm going to leave us with two thoughts for next week. The first thought is that Goats and Coats seems to split. Goats and Coats itself has now two tracks. There's the Joseph track and the Judah track, and we're going to have to start to find the different paths between those two tracks. But there's another interesting element here, which I've indicated with a dotted line down the middle, because so far I've given us two worlds, or two different ways of thinking. There's the three creation stories, and then there's the three stories over here of Goats and Coats, of Jacob's and deception. Three different stories on this side as well. Next week, what I want to do is rip apart the central barrier and say that actually the garden stories meet the goat stories in the Teraphim story. That there's another world. It's not just Adam's world, Noah's world, and Abraham's world. There's another world which, with all of these three elements, with the creation element, with a tree temptation element, with a Shabbat element, where finding its source in the Teraphim story, finding its source right there. Then we can really see this network all coming together, and we'll continue it on in the two tracks of Joseph and Judah. Thank you so much for chasing away the lullabies with me. I mean, just one takeaway from this evening for me is this is so much more complicated than a bunch of stories. This is a whole web, a web of concepts, a web of ideas, a web of intertextual parallels as we develop and we go on. And the thing is, for the protagonists themselves, they didn't know what the end result was going to be. Each of them was sharing, was experiencing a new challenge, a new moment. What would they do? Could Judah stand up and break the cycle? Could Rachel stand up and break the cycle? Could Jacob? Each time they're being given a new opportunity to change the story a little bit, or do they fall back into the old trap? We'll continue that question and continue this journey next week as we chase away